Veil of Darkness. The year was 1882. The winds of Duskwatch carried tales of despair. Nestled deep within the shadow of Black Spire Mountain, the village existed as if forgotten by time. The dense forest surrounding it whispered secrets to those brave or foolish enough to listen. For decades, the villagers spoke of a veil, a darkness that crept upon them every 50 years, leaving death and madness in its wake. Few survived to tell the tale, and those who did rarely spoke of it. A lantern creaked gently in the cold breeze outside the Crow family's cottage. Inside, a little girl hummed an eerie tune, her fingers tracing the frost-kissed glass of the window. "Mama," she whispered, her voice trembling. "They're here again." The mother paled, her hands shaking as she extinguished the lantern. "Get away from the window, child. Never look at them." But it was too late. The child's eyes widened with terror as shadowy figures emerged through the fog, and its hollow faces reflected back. Elias Grayson readjusted his overcoat as the carriage came to a stop at the edge of Duskwatch. The village was eerily silent, except for the distant cawing of crows. His sister, Emily, jumped out with a cheerful smile, clutching a notebook. "This is the perfect place for your research, Elias," she said. "It is as if the air itself holds secrets." Marion Crow, standing beside them, watched with a quiet suspicion. "You must be the visitors," she said softly, her voice barely carrying over the wind. "The Graysons, correct?" "Yes," Elias replied. "And you are?" "Marion Crow. Herbalist if you're curious. But if you're wise, you'll turn back now." Elias chuckled. "I appreciate the concern, Miss Crow, but I'm here for answers, not warnings." Marion's eyes grew somber. "Answers you want?" The veil doesn't take kindly to questions. It was Duskwatch's Festival of Shadows, the night when the curse was kept at bay. Lanterns were everywhere, their flames dancing restlessly. Children wore wooden and cloth masks, and the elders whispered prayers in the darkness. Elias and Emily wandered through the festivities, noting the unease in the villagers' eyes. Jacob Holloway approached them, leaning heavily on his cane. "You're brave to come during the festival," he said. "Most outsiders wouldn't dare." "And why is that?" Elias asked. "Because the veil watches those who do not belong," Jacob replied cryptically, his gaze fixed on Emily. "It always takes the curious first." The streets of Duskwatch, though alive with flickering lights and distant laughter, felt oddly hollow. The Graysons wandered cautiously, observing the peculiar traditions. Wooden effigies, some no taller than a child, lined the village square. Their carved faces bore expressions of agony, their hollow eyes seeming to follow every movement. Emily paused to sketch one of the figures. "What are these for?" she asked Jacob Holloway, who had silently appeared beside them. "Wards," he replied curtly. "The wood keeps the shadows at bay, or so they say." Elias tilted his head skeptically. "Superstition?" Jacob fixed him with a sharp, searching stare. "Call it what you will, but those who mock the veil seldom last long here." Before Elias could say a word, the sound of a flute filled the square. Villagers stopped in their tracks, their faces paling as the mournful tune washed over them. Marion Crow emerged from the shadows, her gaze darting nervously toward the forest. "Not again," she muttered, clutching a bundle of herbs. Emily frowned. "What's happening?" "The Watcher," Marion whispered. "It walks when the music plays." The villagers ran off, locking their doors and retreating to their homes. Only the Graysons, Marion, and Jacob remained in the square. "Come with me," Marion said urgently. "You shouldn't be out here." The Crow family's cottage was small but cozy, filled with the earthy scent of dried herbs. Marion set a kettle on the fire, her movements hurried. "You don't belong here," she said, glancing nervously at the window. Elias folded his arms. "I've heard that several times already." Care to explain why? She hesitated before pulling a tattered book from a shelf. Its leather cover was etched with strange symbols. The veil is not just a story, she said. It's a force, a living shadow that preys on fear. Emily leaned closer, her curiosity piqued. And the flute? It calls the Watcher, a harbinger of the veil, Marion explained. It's said that those who hear it and look into the fog are marked. Elias smirked. Marked for what? Marion's expression darkened. To disappear. Before Elias could dismiss her words, a chilling sound echoed through the room, a faint knock at the window. Don't move, Marion hissed. The knocking grew louder, more insistent. Emily reached for the curtains, but Marion caught her wrist. Don't look, she snapped. The room plunged into silence, save for the crackling of the fire. When the knocking finally ceased, Marion exhaled shakily. It's gone. What was it? Emily whispered. Marion's voice was barely audible, a shadow seeking a host. The village was up in arms the next morning. A child named Thomas had disappeared in the night of the festival. His mother clutched a small wooden effigy he had been carrying when he went missing. They always take one, Jacob muttered to himself, watching as the Graysons approached. Elias's frown deepened. Who's they? Jacob didn't answer, his eyes stuck on the forest. Marion came running up to them, her face as pale as moonlight. We need to find him, she said, before it's too late. The group ventured into the woods, the air filled with unease. As they went deeper, darkness consumed them, as though sunlight itself was afraid to penetrate through trees. Emily stopped and pointed toward a patch of dirt which had been disturbed. Look! Elias fell to his knees and, brushing aside leaves, came upon a child's toy, Thomas's wooden horse. Near it was a trail of small footprints leading deeper into the forest. Stay close, Marion cautioned. The woods don't care for wanderers. They followed the path as it wound them deeper into the trees. The bark seemed to come closer, stretching out with arthritic fingers like skeletons. Words drifted on the wind, meaningless yet threatening. Then a growl sprang out of the shadows. Marion went stiff. She wrapped her hand a little tighter over a sack of herbs. Not alone, she whispered to herself. A figure emerged, a hulking shape swathed in shadow. Its eyes glowed faintly, and its form shifted like smoke. The group backed away slowly, but the creature advanced. Run! Marion shouted, tossing a handful of herbs at the figure. The creature recoiled, its form dissolving briefly before reforming. They ran back toward the village, hearing heavy footsteps behind them. When they finally emerged into the open, the creature stopped at the edge of the trees, its glowing eyes watching them before it vanished into the shadows. That evening, the group gathered at Jacob's home, where the elder reluctantly revealed the village's darkest secret. The veil of darkness is no myth, he started, his voice heavy with sorrow. It was born from tragedy, a betrayal that stained this land forever. He spoke of an ancient ritual gone wrong, a pact with shadowy forces that demanded a terrible price. The veil, he explained, was both a curse and a guardian, punishing those who sought to break the pact. Marion was worried. Why didn't you tell us this sooner? Because knowing doesn't save you, Jacob said. It only makes you a target. Elias leaned forward. Then how do we stop it? Jacob hesitated. There is a way, but it comes at a cost. Before he could elaborate, the mournful sound of the flute echoed through the village once more. The mournful sound of the flute was a warning, but the Graysons were not deterred. Elias paced Jacob's dimly lit parlor, his frustration mounting. You're telling us there's a way to stop this curse, but you won't share it? He snapped. Jacob sighed, as if the weight of the years had finally caught up with him. It's not that simple, he said. The veil needs balance. If you tear it away from this side, you must replace it with something. or someone. Marion stood near the window, flinched at the word. A sacrifice? Jacob nodded solemnly. A sacrifice strong enough to hold the darkness. Emily's voice trembled. And what happens to the person who becomes the anchor? Jacob hesitated before answering. They're consumed. Their soul becomes part of the veil. The room fell into uneasy silence, broken only by the crackle of the fire. Finally, Elias spoke, his voice firm. Then we find another way. No one's sacrificing anything. But deep down, each of them knew the path ahead was fraught with impossible choices. The Graysons and Marion wanted to research the flute player, a ghost in the village now, since they were not aware of anyone who knew them or of their disappearance after the mysterious song. It was past midnight when Emily sneaked into the woods with her determination to sketch the mystery man. With each step, she followed the flute, beating heart pounding at every footfall. The trees appeared as if they were breathing. Their branches moved as if they were alive despite the still air. Shadows crept along the ground, twisting and writhing like mockery at her bravery. At last, she came upon a clearing. In its middle stood a figure all clad in black, hood pulled up to conceal the face. The flute he was playing was made from bone, and the music pierced the silence. Emily crouched behind a fallen tree, her fingers shaking as she started to draw. The figure stopped playing. "Why do you hide in the shadows?" a voice rasped. Emily froze, her blood turning to ice. Before she could say anything, the figure turned toward her. Its face obscured, but its eyes, two pinpricks of burning light, boring into her soul. "You are marked," it whispered. "The veil sees you now." A blast of cold air swept through her, and everything blacked out. When Emily was awake again, she sat in her room, and the feeling of dread lingers. Marion stood above her, her face like stone. "You shouldn't have walked into the forest alone," Marion said. Emily sat up, holding to her sketchbook. "I saw the flute player. They said something to me." Marion went pale. "What did they say?" The revelation spread through the village, heightening tensions. Some villagers blamed the Graysons for stirring the veil's wrath, while others insisted the curse had always been a ticking time bomb. Jacob called a meeting in the town hall, urging unity. "Fear feeds the veil," he warned. "If we let it divide us, we're doomed." But his words fell on deaf ears. The villagers argued bitterly, their fear manifesting as anger. In the midst of the chaos, Elias stood up. "We'll find a way to end this, with or without your help," he declared. Determined to uncover the truth, Elias and Emily delved into the village archives. The dusty tomes spoke of Duskwatch's founding and the pact made with the Veil centuries ago. The original settlers, desperate for protection from marauding invaders, had called upon a shadowy entity. In exchange for their safety, the Veil required an annual offering, a soul to sustain its power. Emily discovered a worn map that pinpointed the location of an ancient altar deep in the forest. "This must be where the pact was made," she said. Elias nodded. "If we can destroy the altar, maybe we can break the curse." Marion, who had been listening quietly, shook her head. "The Veil won't let you near it without a fight." "We'll be ready," Elias said firmly. Armed with Jacob's knowledge and Marion's protective herbs, the group ventured into the heart of the forest. The journey was perilous. The air grew colder, and the shadows more oppressive with each step. They found bizarre happenings, bleeding black sap from trees, names called out to them by the wind, and ephemeral visions of faces in the peripheral parts of their sight. There came a time when they reached a clearing littered with the corpses of people who had attempted to oppose the Veil. Tattered arms and decomposing cadavers were there as some kind of warning sign. "Move forward," Elias encouraged, but he too was beginning to lose his resolve. Finally, they came to the altar, a huge stone slab carved with runes that pulsed with an unearthly light. Malice clung heavy in the air, and the shadows coalesced into a towering figure. the Watcher. "You dare defy the veil?" it thundered, its voice shaking the ground. Elias stepped forward, gripping a torch. "We won't let this curse destroy another life." The Watcher lunged, and chaos erupted. The Watcher towered above the group, its shape a churning mass of darkness with glowing red eyes that seemed to pierce the soul. Elias held the torch high, the flames dancing in the wind as if they were afraid of the thing. "It won't back down," Jacob whispered, clutching a talisman close to his chest. "The veil is protecting its heart." Emily, shaking but determined, stepped forward. "What does it want from us?" The Watcher's voice rumbled like thunder. "The balance must be restored. A pact was broken, and the price must be paid." As the words did echo, the ground crumbled beneath the altar as a swirling vortex of darkness appeared to open up. The air clung with despair, and a sinister pull drew them in. "We have to destroy the altar," Elias shouted. Marian scattered a circle of protection herbs around them, muttering prayers to herself. Jacob began reading the runes on the altar, hoping to find a weakness in the creature. In the blink of an eye, the Watcher attacked Emily, its claw appendage swiping at her. Elias pushed her out of the way, and she hit the ground hard as Elias fell. "You are branded," the Watcher screamed, its eyes fixed on Emily. "Stay away from her," Elias roared, swinging the torch toward the entity. The flames flickered harmlessly against the shadows. "Keep it distracted," Jacob yelled, his voice rising over the chaos. As the battle raged, Jacob deciphered the rune's secret, a chant that could weaken the veil's hold. But it required an act of pure will. Someone had to willingly offer their soul to channel the spell. "No one's throwing themselves away," Elias shouted as he dodged another attack from the Watcher. Marian shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "If we don't, the veil will consume us all." Emily, holding on to her sketchbook, realized something suddenly. Her drawings, the ones she made since coming to Duskwatch, were disturbingly close to the runes on the altar. "Emily," Jacob said, his eyes opened wide, "you have been tapping into the veil. This is why it branded you. You are what will bring about the end." With trembling hands, Emily flicked through the pages of her sketchbook. The images seemed alive, their outlines glowing with a faint light. "What do I do?" "You must complete the final symbol," Jacob said, pointing at an empty page. "The only way to shut the portal is complete the last figure." Tears welled in her eyes. "What happens if I do?" Jacob hesitated. "It will bind the veil to you. You'll become its anchor." The Watcher roared, its form unraveling as the group pushed back against its attacks. Emily sat on the ground, frantically drawing the final rune. Each stroke seemed to sap her strength, her vision blurring as the lines glowed brighter. "You don't have to do this," Elias yelled, grabbing her arm. Emily shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "If I don't, it'll never stop. It'll destroy everyone." Marian knelt beside her, placing a comforting hand on her shoulder. "We'll make sure your sacrifice isn't in vain." As Emily finished the rune, a blinding light burst forth from the sketchbook. The Watcher let out an ear-piercing shriek as the vortex of darkness collapsed inward. "Emily, no!" Elias cried as light consumed her. For a moment there was silence. Then the altar shattered and the Watcher vanished, leaving behind a faint whisper. Balance restored. As the dust finally settled, the forest remained eerily silent. Gone was the oppressive energy that had hung over Duskwatch like a dark cloud. Instead, there was an uncanny stillness. Elias frantically searched for Emily, but all he could find was her sketchbook, its pages blank. Marian placed a hand on his shoulder, her face etched with grief. "She's gone," Marian said softly. Elias clasped the sketchbook to his chest, his heart breaking. "She saved us all." The villagers came out, somewhat hesitant but hopeful at the same time. For centuries, they had been plagued by an evil force, and it finally had been defeated with the ultimate sacrifice of Emily. You owe her a debt we can never repay. Remind yourselves of the price you paid for your mistakes past, Jacob said to the gathered masses. Months passed, but life in Duskwatch slowly returned to normal. But the loss of Emily had carved a hole in Elias he could never fill. Each day was spent on putting the village back in good shape and nights spent over his sketchbook, only to feel her presence as he drew. One day, sitting by the flames, he opened her sketchbook. To his shock, a single image had appeared within it. A faint line of Emily, smiling very softly. Maria stood in the doorway and whispered, "She's with us." Elias nodded and wept. Always. Though the veil was gone, its remembrance haunted them, for it reminded them of that other darkness that had once had Duskwatch in a tight grip. And some way, beyond the reach of mortal men, there, Emily stood watch, tied to the veil through her soul, guarding balance she had fought so hard to restore.